Hello everyone. In this video I'll be talking about the murder trial for Alek Minassian, the man who killed 10 people in Toronto in 2018 in an incident known as the Toronto van attack. He ran over people in the streets of Toronto using a rider rental van and was later apprehended by police. Alek Minassian identifies as a member of the incel movement, an online subculture of men who are frustrated with not being able to have romantic or sexual relationships with women. After he was arrested, Minassian told police that he committed the attack because he blamed women for his lack of sexual success, and wanted to start an uprising to overthrow society and force women to sleep with incels. He also told police that he was inspired by Elliot Rodger, the spiritual founder of the incel movement, who murdered 6 people during a rampage in California in 2014. Rodger, like Minassian, stated that he committed his attack because he wanted to get revenge on society because women wouldn't sleep with him. The fact that Alek Minassian committed the attack is not being disputed. The question to be decided in the trial is whether Minassian will be found guilty and sent to prison, or whether he will be found not guilty by reason of a mental disorder and sent to a mental hospital. This is commonly known as an insanity defense. In the province of Ontario, where Alek Minassian is from, not guilty by reason of a mental disorder is known as NCR, or not criminally responsible. Alek Minassian has pled not criminally responsible, and the argument being made by his defense team is that Minassian's autism spectrum disorder, also known as autism, prevented him from understanding the difference between right and wrong when he committed his attack. I'll be releasing videos throughout the trial, which began on November 10th and is expected to last 6 weeks. This video is going to focus on Alek Minassian's NCR defense. Because of the activist work that I do, I've studied Canadian criminal law and how the Canadian justice system works. I'm also on the autism spectrum myself, which puts me in a position to comment on what's going on with Alek Minassian and whether his NCR defense on the basis of having autism has any merit. In this video, I'm going to explain what an NCR defense is, provide some legal background about why it exists, and talk about what happens if a person is found NCR. Before I continue, I think I should point out that I don't work for the criminal justice system, the mental health system, or the media, and I'm not a qualified expert of any kind. In Canadian law, a crime is defined as a combination of criminal intent, known as mens rea, and the criminal act, known as actus reus. The concept of criminal intent is fairly complicated and can be difficult to understand, but put very simply, it means that you have to intend to commit a crime in order to be guilty of one. Since criminal intent is a necessary element of a crime, a person cannot be convicted of a crime if they don't have the mental capacity to understand that what they did was wrong. In Canada, the age of criminal responsibility is 12, meaning you can't be convicted of a crime if you're younger than that. This is because our legal system has decided that children younger than 12 don't have the intellectual or moral capacity to adequately understand the concepts of crime and responsibility. Now, you might ask, what if an adult with the mental capacity of a child younger than 12 commits a crime? Suppose, for example, that the offender is an adult with Down syndrome who has the mental capacity of a 5-year-old. What happens then? Well, this is where the concept of not criminally responsible by reason of a mental disorder comes in. If the offender's mental capacity is called into question, the court will order a mental health assessment, where experts in forensic psychology and psychiatry will assess the offender in order to learn about his disorder and level of criminal responsibility. They may also procure his past mental health assessments and diagnoses in order to help them in their decision. If there's a case to be made that the defendant has a mental disorder that prevented him from having the mental capacity to know that what he did was wrong, he will plead not criminally responsible by reason of a mental disorder. Expert witnesses who have assessed him will testify about how his disorder affects him and whether he's criminally responsible for what he did. Both the prosecution and the defense will have an opportunity to cross-examine the expert witnesses, and the judge will make a decision about whether he's criminally responsible. If it is determined that he's criminally responsible, he will be found guilty and sent to jail just like everyone else. If he's found NCR, he will be sent to a forensic mental hospital for treatment and will not be released until it's determined that he's no longer a danger to society, as they put it. The amount of time the person spends in the mental hospital before being released is at the discretion of a legislative body responsible for overseeing all offenders found NCR. In Ontario, this body is known as the Ontario Review Board, or ORB. Every year, the doctors responsible for assessing the patient and overseeing his treatment will submit their findings to the ORB. The ORB will then determine if the patient is being rehabilitated and whether he should be released. If the person is deemed by the ORB to be improving, he may be given more privileges within the hospital, such as the ability to have visitors and the ability to make supervised trips within the community. If he is determined to be rehabilitated, he will be released into the community and given an absolute discharge, meaning that the criminal conviction is wiped from his record. There will also usually be an outpatient treatment plan in place to ensure the person continues to get help managing his disorder. Now, the idea of people with severe learning disabilities being found NCR and going through this process isn't all that controversial. Canadians tend to view this as a more humane and ethical alternative to sending them to a prison filled with hardened criminals. However, the NCR defense can also be used by people suffering from psychotic illnesses, such as schizophrenia. These are people who may normally be sane and rational, but who can enter into states of psychosis where they are no longer able to distinguish fantasy from reality and who therefore can't properly understand the difference between right and wrong. An example of this would be a paranoid schizophrenic who, in the midst of a psychotic episode, comes to believe that his next-door neighbor is actually an alien who is trying to kill him and his family by beaming microwave radiation into their brains. He goes and beats up his next-door neighbor to try to stop him from doing this, and is then arrested and charged with assault. Now, if what the offender believed was actually true, what he did would be moral and not a crime. He was behaving morally given what he was perceiving at the time, however his perceptions were distorted due to his illness, which isn't his fault. Thus, the person would be viewed as not criminally responsible if experts who assessed him were able to satisfy the judge that the offender was schizophrenic, was psychotic at the time, and actually believed this stuff. This is a much more controversial application of the NCR defense. One of the reasons for this is that there are a lot of public misconceptions about it. Some people think that just having an illness like schizophrenia or being psychotic at the time of an offense means you will be found NCR. This is false. Being psychotic or having a psychotic illness at the time an offense is committed, in and of themselves, isn't sufficient. Put simply, it's not enough to just be crazy. You have to be crazy in a very specific way that made you think that committing your offense was actually moral. This is a fairly high threshold of proof which doesn't succeed in many cases. Now, obviously this isn't an exact science, and it rests on the professional judgment of the judge and the testifying experts. This brings me to another reason why this type of NCR defense is controversial. What if an offender who doesn't want to be held criminally responsible pretends to be crazy in order to avoid a criminal conviction and do his time in a cushy mental hospital instead of a jail? This was the plot of the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which you may have seen. Well, when you think about it, pretending to be crazy isn't as easy as you might think. You'd have to spend months or years consistently fooling a team of forensic psychologists and psychiatrists, people who deal with criminals every day and who are used to patients lying and trying to manipulate them. People who know what all of the symptoms of psychotic disorders are and are not. Yes, there are people who have done it, but it's no picnic. And then, what if you succeed? Well, if you saw One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, you'll remember that once the protagonist convinced all the doctors that he was crazy and got committed to the mental hospital, he wasn't able to then convince them that he wasn't crazy anymore, and they didn't let him out. This also happens in real life. One thing I've learned from researching NCR cases is that the ORB is actually quite conservative about releasing people. If there's any doubt at all about what's wrong with a person or about whether they are still a danger to society, they don't let him out. Forensic mental health experts who believe their patient is not dangerous often have to fight tooth and nail with the ORB to get them to release him, and often do not succeed. There are people who get found NCR for minor offenses like uttering threats or common assault, for which they'd normally get around a month or two in jail, that end up spending years in a mental hospital because the ORB isn't sure about whether they're still dangerous or not. You can see why this might not be appealing to a criminal who wants to avoid being convicted and going to jail for his crime. If an individual commits a crime and gets a jail sentence, he has a set amount of time to spend being incarcerated before being released, whether anyone thinks he's been rehabilitated or not. He can spend all of his time in jail smoking weed and talking about all of the banks he's going to rob when he gets out, and they'll still let him out once his sentence is over. However, if he's found NCR and gets committed to a mental hospital, he'll be there indefinitely and will be at the mercy of his doctors and the ORB to make a relatively subjective decision about whether he's still a danger to society. Everything he says and does in the mental hospital will be watched and analyzed, and can be used by the ORB to justify his further detention. So it can be kind of a crapshoot. There are people who've committed minor offenses who spend decades or even their whole lives in a forensic mental hospital, and there are murderers who get out after only a few years. This makes the whole NCR system seem bizarre and capricious to the public, and there's often a public outcry when someone who's done something heinous gets released after only a few years. One infamous case that I've seen brought up in articles discussing the Minassian trial is that of a man named Vince Lee. Vince Lee murdered, beheaded, and cannibalized a man named Tim McLean on a Greyhound bus in Manitoba in 2008. The attack was completely unprovoked, and Lee had no prior relationship with McLean. He was arrested and charged with murder. Lee was diagnosed with schizophrenia and had a history of hearing voices and behaving strangely. He often thought that God was talking to him, and was once involuntarily committed to a mental hospital for walking down a highway because he thought that God had told him to follow the sun. He received inadequate treatment and never took medication for his illness. After the attack, he told the doctors assessing him that he had heard the voice of God telling him that McLean was a demon, and that God would kill him immediately if he didn't kill McLean. He said he thought McLean would come back to life and kill him if he didn't dismember him and eat him. When he was later arrested by police, Lee cried and told them, "I'm sorry, I'm guilty, please kill me." In 2009, Lee was found not criminally responsible and sent to a mental hospital. He started taking medication, and doctors noticed a large improvement in his ability to function. He complied with all of his treatment orders and expressed remorse for what he did. He was granted an absolute discharge and released in 2017, 9 years after he was found NCR. If he had been convicted of murder, he would have spent considerably more time in a prison. This case had a lasting impact on Canadians. I remember hearing about it and being disturbed by it, and I still sometimes think about it when I travel on a Greyhound bus. Now, the point I'm trying to make by bringing this case up is that whether you believe what Vince Lee said about his state of mind or not, or whether you believe it was right for him to be found NCR or not, this is exactly the kind of case that an NCR defense based on a mental illness is intended for. So, now that I've given you a bit of background about NCR cases, where does that leave us with Alek Minassian? Alek Minassian has hired a defense lawyer named Boris Bytensky. In Canada, a crime is viewed as an offense against the state, with the British monarch or crown being the injured party. Prosecuting attorneys are referred to as crown attorneys or crowns. The accused is responsible for hiring their own defense attorney. In Ontario, if the accused can't afford a lawyer, a service called Legal Aid Ontario will pay for a lawyer if he's deemed to be eligible for it. This is similar to a public defender in the United States. Boris Bytensky has an entry on the Legal Aid Ontario website, which means that he takes legal aid cases. We can see that he specializes in criminal law and ORB cases, so he has some experience litigating for people who've been found NCR. Bytensky is not arguing that Minassian has a psychotic disorder like schizophrenia or any psychotic symptoms at all. He is also not arguing that Minassian is too developmentally delayed to understand the difference between right and wrong in the way that someone with Down syndrome would be. None of the examples that I described to you, for which the NCR defense is commonly used, apply. Bytensky is instead arguing that Minassian's learning disability, known as Asperger's syndrome, which is a type of autism spectrum disorder, prevented him from understanding that what he was doing was wrong. One of the mental health experts called by the defense is a man named Alexander Westphal, a professor of psychiatry at the Yale School of Medicine. According to a report submitted to the court by Westphal, Minassian's autistic way of thinking was severely distorted in a way similar to psychosis, and that he is therefore NCR. Dr. Westphal is involved in researching the link between autism and criminal behavior, and wrote a paper in 2015 called Autism Spectrum Disorder and Criminal Justice. This paper is free and doesn't require academic journal access to obtain, so I'll link it in the description. In this paper, Dr. Westphal provides several examples of cases where people with autism were arrested for committing crimes, and where an NCR defense might have made sense. One example he gives is of stalking behavior. People with autism have difficulty understanding social norms and nonverbal cues, and so behavior that would be easily recognized as creepy or stalking by a normal person might not be recognized as such by a person with autism. The person with autism might also not be able to understand that what he is doing is upsetting the victim because he isn't able to read the nonverbal cues indicating that the victim is upset, angry, or scared. People with autism also frequently have very specific obsessive interests. Another example Westphal gives is of a low-functioning person with autism who is obsessed with scents and perfumes. He hoarded bottles of perfume, asked his family to give him perfume as gifts, and asked to smell everyone he met. One time, he asked a young woman if he could smell her, and she freaked out and called the police. He was arrested and didn't understand why what he did was wrong. A third and hypothetical example Westphal gives is of a person with autism who is hypersensitive to lights, noises, or other physical sensations, a common problem for people with autism. Someone like that who is in a crowded public place and hears a loud noise might freak out and accidentally hurt someone. Would it be fair to convict that person of a criminal offense? Now, these are all valid concerns, and it may very well be the case that some people with autism who do these things should not be convicted of a criminal offense. However, Alek Minassian's actions do not fall within any of these categories. Unlike all of the people Westphal's paper describes, Minassian did what he did on purpose and knew what he did was wrong. Just listen to what he told the police when he was arrested.
Are you suffering from any illnesses?
Yes, I'm a murdering piece of shit.
Alek Minassian spent hours being interviewed by police, in which he candidly told them all about what he did and why he did it. He was lucid, he answered questions, and his attack was premeditated in detail well before it happened. The Crown prosecutor heavily relied on the police interrogation video to make his case for why Alek Minassian should be found guilty. Minassian's NCR defense has been condemned by autism advocacy groups, who argue that people with Asperger's syndrome are able to understand the difference between right and wrong, that having autism doesn't make people violent, and that Minassian's use of this defense will further stigmatize them. Here's a statement about this from Autism Canada. With regard to the ongoing trial of Mr. Alek Minassian, Autism Canada wishes to publicly denounce the egregious claims made by defense counsel psychiatrists who attribute the accused's actions to his autistic way of thinking, severely distorted, similar to psychosis. There is no psychosis in ASD and no tendency to antisocial behavior any more than in the general population. I think you will not get any serious objection from the academic community on that account, said Dr. Peter Zatmari of the Child and Youth Mental Health Collaborative, or CAMH. Autism Canada wishes to respond emphatically that these claims are wholly unsubstantiated, merely speculative, and made carelessly without any published evidence proving autism on its own is a risk factor for becoming violent against other people. Autism Canada Board Chair Dermot Cleary states, "In the event that Dr. Westphal's written report for the defense is entered into evidence, we will make an application to obtain a copy and will provide a more precise response at that time. We ask that all parties be mindful of the potential for unwarranted and negative perceptions which can impact over 500,000 Canadians living with autism spectrum disorder." Autism Ontario issued a statement as well. Cultivated misogyny and sense of entitlement responsible, not autism. Autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder characterized by social impairments and difficulty inferring the thoughts, feelings, and emotions of others. It is not characterized by violence or a lack of a moral compass. Nor are autism and mental illness synonymous. Too often, the broader underlying factors are ignored, which leads to unfortunate stereotyping. In reality, people on the autism spectrum and with other disabilities are much more likely to be victims of crime rather than the perpetrators. The myth that autism causes criminal behavior is exactly that, a myth. Much too often when a person is diagnosed as autistic, their actions are examined exclusively through that lens without considering the broader picture of other influencing factors on the whole person. This is demeaning to everyone. As a society, we need to move away from the social construction of autistic people and people with mental health issues as scapegoats for violent acts. Instead, we must focus on the proliferation of misogynistic and other supremacist ideas readily available for consumption and woven into our social fabric. These horrific crimes were actions driven by cultivated misogyny and a sense of entitlement, not by autism. Conflating what took place on April 23, 2018 with anything else obstructs our view of what needs to change. So, we have two competing views here. Alek Minassian and his defense team are arguing that he lacked the capacity for a moral compass because of his autism and that he shouldn't be held criminally responsible for murdering 10 people because he didn't know any better. The Crown and groups like Autism Ontario and Autism Canada see Minassian's attack as an act of conscious malevolence, driven by his incel ideology, his entitlement, and his hatred of women, not by autism. In other words, Alek Minassian is a terrorist and deserves to be treated as such. In my next video, I'll be analyzing Minassian's police interrogation video as well as some of the evidence being put forth by his defense team.